This interview with Juliette Verrengia is going to be our last DefLove episode. It felt fitting to close out the series with a talk on healthy relationships, which is what DefLove set out to explore. So this Valentine's Day, we're going to say goodbye, but for now, enjoy this guest interview. So on this guest episode of DefLove, I have with me Juliette Verrengia. She is an interpersonal violence prevention and education specialist at Pace University. Juliette, could you please just give us a background as to what that sort of job is and does?
Sure. So I was hired at Pace University a bit over a year and a half ago. I'm a social worker licensed in the state of New York, and that's important because everything that I do relates back to social work in a couple of key areas. So at Pace, I'm a confidential resource, and that is for two reasons. So one is because the university designated me as such, and I'm double backed by my social work license, right? So I can meet with students confidentially to talk about any issues related to sexual misconduct, right? Which includes anything from dating violence, harassment, stalking, exploitation, sexual assault. We can talk about any of those topics. What's special about that is that most employees of a university are not confidential. They are legally required because of a piece of legislation called Title IX to share information when they have it with the college, right? So if a student tells them that they were in an unhealthy or abusive relationship and they need help, or they experience an assault over the weekend or something like that, the professor, for example, or staff member has to tell our Title IX office to make sure that that student's protected and that we're in compliance with the law. So a little bit of background about that. I do not have that obligation, and I actually have a completely oppositional obligation. So I have to keep information confidential unless a student specifically indicates that they're going to harm themselves or somebody else. So that confidentiality allows me to meet with students who need support and resources on campus or just need a space to talk through their experiences, ask questions, whatever it is. So we're kind of a catch-all office for relationships, sex, dating culture, things like that. I supervise a wonderful group of students on the New York City campus. There's an equivalent group on the Pleasantville campus. So both of those student groups are also confidential. So the students are hired through my office, trained to be confidential resources, get a lot of information about supporting people who've experienced interpersonal violence, and they help the office by running educational events and workshops and meeting individually with students who need some peer support. And then that kind of other bulk of information or responsibility is the community outreach, the community education portion, which is one of my favorite parts because it means, anything from tabling in the student center about my office to talking about bystander intervention, supporting survivors, consent. So I'm working with students, staff, and faculty to just raise these topics and hopefully make them a little bit less taboo so students feel like they can ask questions and talk about sex and relationships and sexuality and really important topics that a lot of times people aren't given the space to explore.
Has this always been like a thing at Pace or most universities, or is this a fairly new wave of things coming in?
So in terms of the history of higher education, it is fairly new. I had a predecessor in my role, so I took this position from someone else who moved on from Pace. But the office at Pace generated through a lot of student activism. So students wanted a specific office, a specific staff member, and student career positions, right, for things related to sexual assault, things related to relationships and sex and wellness in general. And so my office kind of filled that gap because a lot of students who have issues around these things go to the counseling center. That's a wonderful resource as well. But my office is a little bit more honed in and kind of specific with the services that we could provide. So nationally, as colleges were more publicly getting, slammed with lawsuits, and students were speaking out about the horrible experiences that they had with getting support from an institution around sexual assault specifically, but also dating violence. It got national attention, right? And we needed better systems. We needed more coordination on all campuses around supporting survivors. And, Title IX is a piece of federal legislation, but there are also state and city bills that dictate how we do education and prevention, how we support survivors. So all those things are working in tandem to create offices like mine and positions like mine, to provide, more opportunities for students to seek support. But it is fairly new. And there's typically one or two people that do this per college. So, it is new. It's very exciting. The field is still being professionalized in terms of, there are conferences, there are listservs and groups to get campus professionals and advocates together to kind of strategize how to support students. But kind of in the scheme of centuries, it's very new.
So then I guess just how did you find yourself involved as a specialist in this sort of new field?
That's a good question. So it's kind of, anti-violence work, specifically domestic and dating violence and sexual violence has really always been my main focus area. I always talk about how my mother really inspired me to be in the anti-violence field, to really learn about feminism, what that means on a practical level. She was always, my mom started like our gender equity committee in our PTA. And she worked for a long time at an organization in New York City called Sanctuary for Families. And it's a really, really wonderful organization that supports people who have been trafficked or have experienced domestic violence. Through legal services and clinical services and economic empowerment programs. And so I kind of got my in through her work there. And for I think about 3 summers in different capacities, I was interning and working and volunteering at Sanctuary, and really learning about not only the experiences that people who've experienced violence face, but also the kind of landscape of support, right? Anything from housing to childcare to livable wages to race and gender, like all of these factors play so much into someone's experience in navigating systems of support. You're not going to feel safe or ready to handle emotional trauma or healing if you don't have someplace to live, or you can't find work, or you have an immigration issue, right? So places like Sanctuary do a really good job of comprehensively supporting those folks. And I kind of got my footing through there. In college, when I was an undergraduate, I went to Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut, and I worked for the equivalent of my office there as an intern. And we used a green dot model of bystander intervention, which is a way to encourage students specifically to act on their best instincts and intervene in situations that are potentially harmful, specifically around sexual assault. And so I worked there for 2 years. I absolutely love the outreach. I love talking to students. I love being a supportive kind of person in the community. And so right after college, I went to graduate school. And so I got my master's of social work from Silberman, which is a part of CUNY in the city. And, I worked at a LGBTQ specific anti-violence organization called the Anti-Violence Project for some of my field work, and just learned, as much as I could about the other side of anti-violence work, which is like policy and organizing and civil rights. And so all of that kind of together was a good combination for when this role kind of landed in my lap. And I really wanted to get back to working with students. I really wanted to get back into higher education. And so I went for it. And that's a really long answer to your question. But I started, volunteering at like shelters for women who've experienced violence and children when I was like 14 or 13. So it's always been a little bit of like a niche for me. And I'm really happy to see how it's been playing out.
That's excellent. That's really nice. So, okay. Oh, I've lost my questions. Here it is. So you and I originally met. You gave a talk in a class I was in, the University 101 class. And the talk was mainly on consent and healthy relationships and just all of that. So I guess it's hard to do it in simple terms, but just to sort of ease into this topic, how would you describe what a healthy relationship is?
Oh, that's a really good question. And generally speaking, I think that a healthy relationship, and this goes for intimate relationships, this goes for friendships, family, relationships, whatever it might be, even professional relationships. I think a healthy relationship is one where all parties involved in the relationship feel comfortable, supported, safe, excited, and happy. I think that, in the higher ed space, in anti-violence work, in any sphere, people complicate things like healthy relationships and talking about it. But essentially, I want students to feel really happy. That's because, that's what I'm in the business of. And I feel like we forget that when we try to, think about social media and then think about like hookup culture and think about, texting and all of these things that go into dating and relationships, especially nowadays. And at the end of the day, I want to know if people are happy with their partners and if they feel comfortable and excited and safe and all of that good stuff. So it's really rooted in equity, which includes, no power struggles, like there's trust and honesty and all of those things that we think about, compassion, listening. But at the end of the day, can you also have fun with this person? Do they make you laugh? Do they kind of get you out of your head? All of those things are core components of a healthy relationship. Outside of that, things differ so greatly. People have healthy relationships with one person, with multiple people, healthy relationships that kind of shift that narrative, long distance, whatever it is. There are a million different ways to have a great relationship. But I typically remind students, go with your gut. Like, does this person make you happy most of the time or not?
And if someone is listening, like right now, and listening to the definition, being like, I don't know, how should they like examine the sort of relationships around them to start looking into if they are healthy or not?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And so for anyone listening that is thinking about that, you're not alone. I think that relationships that have some unhealthy behaviors or special relationships that are abusive, and there's a difference that I can talk about if you'd like. Typically people are feeling isolated, or maybe they don't want to talk to people about it because, I've heard this from some people, like, my partner's still a good person, or I don't want to get them in trouble, or I don't want people to hate them, but I want these behaviors to shift or stop. And I would say talk about it. If it's a friend, if it's a caretaker, if it's somebody like me or a counselor, talk about those things, because unhealthy behaviors and dynamics and patterns breed in silence and breed in isolation. And so sometimes the most kind of revolutionary healthy thing that you can do is talk about what's going on. I would also say, it sounds a little like elementary school, but make a list, right? It's not necessarily a pro and con list, but it could be a really helpful way to write out, when this person does XYZ, I feel XYZ. Or these are kind of a list of things that have happened in the past month or two that have made me feel confused or upset or ashamed or sad or bullied, right? What are those things? Because I think sometimes on paper, it's easier to read out, if it wasn't coming from you, if it was coming from somebody else, these things are not okay. And deep down, most of the time, people I work with particularly know that, right? We know if we don't feel good, we know if we feel excited and happy or not. And so I would say, know that you're not alone. Remind yourself, that every single person deserves healthy relationships that don't harm anybody, right? In the way that looks like for them. Talk about it to somebody who you can really trust, and maybe do some journaling work or writing down or listing things that make you feel good and make you feel bad, because the good should absolutely outweigh the bad, tenfold.
And so then I do think it would be good to mention at least a little bit the sort of slope things may slide into upon that they may begin to become more in the like abusive territory. What would that entail? Things like that.
Yeah. And I appreciate you using the word slope, because I actually think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because typically unhealthy relationships that become more and more unhealthy become closer to sort of like an abusive category, if you can think of it that way. It does happen gradually. Sometimes it can happen sort of like a slope where things are going well. We're sort of in the honeymoon phase. And then, things start to shift a little bit. Behaviors start to change. People are feeling less safe. People are feeling confused, right? And we're kind of in that manipulation phase. And then things escalate, right? So I think, one of the key differences to acknowledge is that relationships that are abusive are rooted in power and control. right? So one person is trying to exert power and control over the other person or people in a relationship. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways. It can manifest in things that people probably think of first, like physical or sexual violence. They can also manifest in, emotional or mental abuse, name calling, belittling, gaslighting, isolation. And they can also manifest in financial control, like limiting someone's ability to work, or controlling funds or ruining someone's credit. And then we also think of social and institutional forms of oppression that manifest on a micro level between partners or amongst partners. So if somebody is threatening to out their partner as queer, right? Out their partner as trans or HIV positive, out their partner as undocumented, limit someone's if somebody uses a wheelchair or a walker, like messing with their ability to get around, right? Things like that are clearly breaches of control are something to look out for. But I think warning signs are really helpful to discuss really briefly, because I don't want people to ignore them, right? They're warning signs for a reason. So things like moving super, super, super fast in the beginning. Like if you meet someone on a Monday and 2 Mondays from now, they're saying that they love you and can't live without you. A relationship can be hot and heavy. There can be a lot of lust. There can be a lot of intensity, but it's almost impossible that we're at that stage in 2 weeks, right? So something like that. Inconsistency. So if somebody's treating you one way alone and then a different way in public, right? Whether it's better or worse in either setting, that might be a red flag. Destruction of property might be a red flag. So if somebody like punches a wall during a fight, they're not being intense, they're not being, charismatic, they're showing potential for violence. So that's a red flag, right? And of course, there's a huge spectrum of things that I'm talking about here, but, someone tracking you and Find My Friends or location services, that's a means of control. So all these kinds of things are potential warning signs. And what I like to emphasize when I discuss warning signs is, again, for folks who are listening or watching, really, really go with your gut. If something doesn't feel right to you, it might not be. And that's a great time to talk to a friend, to bring in a professional, to just kind of assess the situation. But really the difference is the control and power aspect of abusive relationships, instead of unhealthy relationships that might be really toxic. I hear young people saying toxic a lot, or volatile, or, they might be breakup, makeup, up and down. Like that might be unhealthy. People aren't happy. People aren't like fulfilled by a relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're in an abusive relationship. I typically try to avoid labeling a student's relationship. If they come to me and say, do you think this is XYZ? I'm 9 times out of 10 going to ask them what they think, because at the end of the day, most people know.
So then I'm debating. No, I think we'll still work into that, because we'll return to that sort of topic later of like the labeling and things. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Sure.
So in the podcast, the DefLove podcast, the whole sort of thing is asking what like love is, and for various people what's felt like and things like that. How have you seen love, or love with like quotations around it, be a sort of factor in a relationship as opposed to one without it? Because I know it can be very different once someone gets in their head that they are in love, to maybe genuinely assess the situation that they're in.
That is such a good question. And I think that the role love plays, or the idea that love plays in a relationship, I talk a lot about messages we've received from media, and being, having media literacy, like understanding what you're actually watching. And I think that the role that love plays is really, a seed is planted with a lot of us that have access to television or whatever it might be really early. I talk about this all the time, but I used to love The Notebook. I really, I'm not that savvy of a person, but I truly love that movie. And, once I ruined my life with all this information about unhealthy relationships, I could really see like these films for what they were. Now I can't go back, which is why I say ruin my life. But for example, some people might be familiar with a scene in The Notebook where the lead woman is on a date with someone who isn't the lead guy, right? And the lead guy, I'm forgetting their names, is begging her to go on a date with him. So he sees her at this carnival that she's on a different date with, and he essentially harasses her and threatens self-harm if she doesn't go on a date with him. So she's like hanging on this, what's it called when you go on a little
the Ferris wheel. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So she's on it, and for folks who haven't seen the movie, he's hanging off one of the little boxes of the Ferris wheel, and he's like, "Go out with me. Say you'll go out with me, or I'm going to drop." So she's scared out of her mind and says, "Yes, I'll go out with you." They end up falling in love and have this amazing love story, which is the point of the film. But when you think of things like that is not what love is, right? Threatening someone or terrifying them into making a choice or coercing them, manipulating them. I mean, that's what he was doing. But a lot of people think like I'm expecting a huge display of emotion, or I'm expecting, a day changing, life altering ultimatum or something really intense. And I think intensity is sometimes conflated with love. And I find that is a main issue. Or similarly with jealousy, right? Jealousy should be something that is manageable. Jealousy is healthy in relationships if it is at an appropriate level, right? If we are feeling a little bit like, oh, that person was flirting with you, and like, oh my God, now I'm a little mad, whatever it is, that could be a healthy thing for a relationship if it's managed appropriately. But jealousy that makes you or motivates you to mistreat somebody or harm somebody or, get so angry, that's not what love is. So I think when I think of that question, it's really what is being conflated with love that is actually unhealthy or rooted in, social roles or gender norms or things that don't do us that much good, right? And I think that relationships that are rooted in genuine love and appreciation and respect for somebody look really different. They look actually more stable. And so the last thought I have on that is, I think sometimes instability or kind of like ups and downs are confused for love, when really love can be really quiet. It can be very peaceful. It can be really, really stabilizing, right? And that's what I look for when I hear from students, like what is the level of destabilization that is coming from having this person in your life, right? Are they fulfilling you? Are they nourishing you? Are they chilling you out? Like that can be a really good thing in a relationship. So I think about the experiences or ideas that are conflated with love. And those are typically absent when there isn't genuine love in the relationship.
There's a siren. I started the whole like DefLove concept. It's going too wild. Because there's this, I realized throughout as early as like freshman year of high school, that everyone was like, I'm never going to find love because it's pictured so perfectly or intensely in the movies that's like, that's never going to happen to me. Mm-hmm. And so it was this sort of thing of trying to tell actual stories of people falling in love to be like, hey, it's possible for you because this is sort of how it happens. Mm-hmm. What sort of media, or if you could make like the perfect romantic movie, but it has like an actually good relationship in it, what would that sort of look like to you?
Oh my gosh, that's so fun. That is so much fun. Well, you know what I will say, something that exists, and then I'll answer your question, is Sex Education on Netflix. Have you seen it?
I've seen bits of it, yeah.
Okay, so definitely you and anyone who's listening, put Sex Education on your list. It does such a beautiful job of showing like actual consent for one thing, like genuine, not perfect, not silent, actual consent. I also just think it's honest about like young people, that it takes place in a high school, like questions around sexual health and like STIs and myths and perceptions and all of that good stuff that isn't addressed as compassionately as it is in Sex Education. So that's a really great example. It's queer centered. It's a wonderful show. Also, they all have accents, which is just like preferable. But I think, if I had a movie, I think it would be It would be queer for one thing. And I think that it would be just because I feel that there's no media out there that shows queer love or lust or affection that is like not super male gazy still. And queer women are always killed off in shows or TVs. They're always struggling with coming out. They're always struggling about like all these really dark things. That's not just like a rom-com about two women that happen to be in love or two men or two non-binary people or anybody. So it would be queer. It would also be, I think, I think something that is missing in a lot of shows is this, the slow and steadiness, which is why I understand that it's not in movies, but I want to see a healthy relationship that genuinely gradually builds. And I want to see someone like, coming to their partner's PhD thesis presentation. And I want to see like a partner being like, hey, I'm exhausted. Do you mind getting the groceries today? And their partner's like, yes, of course. You know what I mean? Like just these small compromises and small actions that make up a relationship. And again, it's not that interesting to watch because sometimes it's just steady. But I would want to watch it. I would want to see like real consent on television where people aren't just like running down the hallway, like getting naked, but they're like, what do you like? Another really good one is, I have to find the name of it. It used to come on HBO. Anyway, it's a TV show about this queer older woman who falls for a much younger, I think, non-binary person, if I remember correctly. And they have this wonderful conversation about STIs and consent. And it's like in a car before a sexual setting is even happening. The younger person is talking about like their sexual history and their consent. And they're like, what about you? And it's so good. And I'll get the name before this is over and give it to you. But yeah, I just feel like a little bit more reality would be really refreshing for me.
Yeah, and that sounds great. Thank you. I'll put it on the screen or mention it at the end or something.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that'll be good. Okay. So I think, flipping completely from going from the ideal sort of story, we DefLove had this one episode titled 7, and in the I planned out each story so that they had. Oh, thank you. So they had this arc, and 7 is like the lowest point of the series because it's dealing with a sophomore girl in high school feeling pressured to lose her virginity. And that was something I wanted to speak on because I know that's even still a thing in college and everything, and even past college. Could you speak on just the concept of virginity and how it can be harmful to an individual or like an existing or forming relationship?
Yes. So I hate virginity. Like I hate the concept. It's so fake. It means nothing. And I also recognize to some people it really means everything. And so I definitely honor where that's coming from. And it's nobody's fault that they've been told that this really insignificant thing about them is super telling. I think that virginity is so wrapped up in concepts of heteronormativity and gender and power. And I think, again, that power is where we have issues when it comes to sex and when it comes to dating. I think that a lot of people either feel a rush or a pressure or a shamefulness around not being physically intimate with somebody yet. But what virginity does is also it really, really limits people's understanding of what sex can be, right? So when I think of virginity, and what I assume a lot of people think is like a really kind of use it or lose it sort of rush for whatever age-based timeline somebody has for themselves, right? Of course, there's a double standard between men and women specifically around what virginity is, and we can touch on that. But for me, when I think about virginity being lost or sex for the first time, I'm thinking penetration, right? I'm thinking penis and vagina, specifically penetration. And that is so far from what sex can be or should be or is for everybody. It doesn't take into account people who experience sexuality differently, right? Who physical touch isn't the primary or only way that they feel attracted or attractive. It doesn't talk about queer sex where penetration is not necessarily the be all end all, or heteronormative sex where penetration isn't the same thing, or people who experience pain vaginally. So whatever it is, they're leaving a hell of a lot out, and it's just a disservice to people who are sexual beings who want to explore, right? The gender piece is really important because, I think that there is a trope that is actually pretty true of young women in high school and college that feel like they need to lose their virginity, and then they do, and then they're blacklisted or made fun of or slut shamed. Whereas men, it's like a coming of age reclamation or, acceptance of power. And again, when we combine power and sex or masculinity and sex, it typically leads to violence. So the virginity narrative is truly not serving anybody, because it's putting pressure on something that is really only both enjoyable and legal when it's without pressure. And I wish we could stop talking like as a society about the idea that it means something, and just take a little bit of the pressure off people, like especially young people who are going through transitions from middle school to high school or high school to college, or from your 20s to your 30s, 40s to 50s. Those life transitions shouldn't be muddled with pressure and concern about sex, right? And so if I could kind of like wave a wand and take that pressure off everybody, I would be a very happy person.
Yeah, the girl who sent in this story, because these are all, stories that have been sent in, she said that it was seen as this thing of like self-worth. And if you haven't had sex, that means you are unattractive. And used this specific phrase that came in my mind when you were talking about it. She said that she thought the younger you are when you lose it, the better, because that means you're more attractive, which is just so really bad on a lot of levels. Could you speak on, I guess, partially just the whole age thing with virginity? The way that the story ends is that she ends up getting in a situation with someone who is a senior, and it ends up being very bad. It's an episode that required some trigger warnings on it, if that, gives you an idea of what it was. Could you give an idea, though, because both of these people were very desperate to lose their virginities, and the senior's justification was before he went to college, he had to lose it. Could you just sort of give some insight into like how age plays into virginity, and like, really speaking on like why it does not matter what age you lose your virginity. Yes, just that sort of deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I want to extend compassion and support to the student or to the person that submitted that story, because it sounds really difficult. And I'm sorry that it did not have a positive ending. And I do hope that she's getting the support that makes her feel the most seen and good. Right. I think that, like I mentioned, the idea that like having sexual intimacy for the first time is a coming of age sort of thing, or an experiential thing. Like people are like, I kind of want to I've heard like get the first time out of the way before college. So that, if I meet someone I really like, I don't seem inexperienced or, not have sex until I find someone I really like these kind of ideas of the perimeters around virginity or losing your virginity or whatever it might be. I think my main ask is why, right? And I would like people to ask themselves why. And there's a book called Sexual Citizens from two researchers at Columbia. One is named Jennifer Hirsch, and I'm forgetting the second person, but it's a really, really interesting qualitative study that they made into a book about students at Columbia and in New York City. And they're asking students about their experiences with sexual assault and sex and alcohol and kind of hookup culture and how we get to the place that we do with alcohol and sexual assault, et cetera, on college campuses. And they have a term called sexual projects. And sexual projects are the reasons why somebody would engage in sexual activity. And it can be anything from like, I want to have a certain experience. Like, I want to have sex with someone who is older than me, or sex with someone who is from a different country, like we speak a different language, or I want to have a child, or I want to be closer to my partner, or I want to feel attractive, right? There are a million reasons why people will have sex. I'm being paid to, right? Whatever it might be. And I really would love to see people, especially young people who are maybe newer to sexual relationships, questioning their sexual scripts. I don't care why people engage in sexual activity as long as it's not hurting them or themselves. The projects don't mean anything to me, but the projects are super, super crucial for other people to be considering. So am I entering into a sexual situation because I feel like I will be more respected amongst my peer group, or on my athletic team, or in my sorority? Or am I entering into the sexual experience because I don't want to seem inexperienced or prude? Or do I want to do this because it makes me feel attractive, which might be a little bit of what you were referencing? I think that awareness is so important in understanding, that understanding of why am I doing this? I think once people have that understanding and awareness, they might still do whatever they're going to do. But I think that they'll begin, or what I've seen is that they'll begin to maybe make different choices, maybe make choices that make them feel a little bit better, more confident over time, because at least they know where it's coming from. Right. And so I think that the concept of age is really interesting. And again, there are so many double standards around who we think should be having sex and shouldn't, and is attractive and isn't attractive. But I think that things like self-esteem and confidence and like feelings of attraction with yourself won't be generated by anybody else ever. And I think that a lot of people don't get taught that early enough, or they're like, oh yeah, self-confidence is something silly, or we all hate our bodies in the 21st century, or like whatever it is. But the idea that like you can really, at the end of the day, you're the only person that can make yourself feel wanted, feel confident, and feel secure in your body. Sex and virginity has nothing to do with that. So it really is a lot about internal work and like therapy. Go to therapy. Like if you're ever interested in having sex, just go to therapy, because there's stuff there for everybody. But the age connection, I think that there's a lot of, negative feelings or stereotypes about people who are a lot older and haven't engaged in sexual intimacy. And what I will say is, one of my mottos is mind your business, because when it comes to sex and sexuality, a lot of our issues could be solved, especially at like the high school level, with just minding our business. And that is developmentally almost impossible to do when you're in middle school and high school. And I know this. And so I do have a lot of empathy for folks at that level who are just trying to fit in. But I will say that your body and your sex life are not things that you can sacrifice to fit in, right? So find something else to fit in with, like a sport, a hobby, an outfit. Like those are the things that we should be trying to conform to. But our sexuality and our body is the one thing that we will always try to remain in control of in a healthy way. And so it shouldn't be compromised. And I would also say my last thought is that it's very hard to have perspective about these types of issues when you are 15, 17, 21, even 25. But again, that's where like therapy or talking to somebody comes into a lot of play if you're comfortable with a parent or a caregiver. But having perspective around the fact that we are not going to be in 8th grade forever, or we are not going to be in college forever, and the rest of our lives, we will feel more autonomous and can make those choices. And so to anyone who feels like they're in a rush or they're not sure, I would just say, hold on and just think about it, because you have nothing but time. Literally, life is so long, especially right now.
I think that's the first time I've really heard the sort of, I guess, saying of like, you're the only one that can give yourself, like, that can make yourself feel attractive and things. Which is so odd that that's the first time I've heard that, but it truly is. Yeah. So that's just so interesting. Yeah, because it seems to be so based on just like other people. It's like, no, it's not.
Right. And I do think there's something, like, it's not unhealthy to like wear something you feel confident with, go to a bar, get attention. Like, I feel like that's how people think about like attraction. That's fine. But if you're not getting that and then you feel incredibly negative, like there's something up there. And I'll also say, like, something you just said reminded me of it. In terms of like worth and self-esteem and like sexuality, you know, I think that there's this standard, like I mentioned, that if women or more feminine people are sexually active early, like there are all these horrible names in the book, or they're doing something wrong. Sex means something different to every single person. And it is 1,000% up to you when and if and how you have sex, again, as long as it's consensual. I don't care, and I will never judge about that. And I think that people should just make their decisions as long as they don't hurt anybody else and mind their business. And then you're on a great path sexually.
Yeah. So the same episode that started the talk of virginity, it's called 7, even though it's episode 4, which is confusing, but you know. It also dealt with the question of consent. So going into the topic of consent, just very broadly, what is consent?
So at the broadest level, consent is permission for something to happen. And in a sexual context, it is permission or agreeing to specific sexual acts.
And then that goes beyond the binary, like yes and no. There are other ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. So consent can be given verbally, non-verbally. I recommend both. I would love to see everybody, you know, if you want to give consent non-verbally with a head nod up and down, or a lot of eye contact, or, you know, pulling someone closer, that's great. If we can also get a verbal yes, a verbal more, a verbal, you know, can I take your shirt off? Like whatever, that'd be great too. So try to double up. Consent is not just yes and no, because what I really want people to be consenting about is, does this position feel good? Is it okay if I use this toy? Can we flip over? Like, do you want it harder? Like whatever it might be. All of those intricacies are part of consent. People have to be fully conscious, which means that they can't be at the point of incapacitation due to alcohol or drugs. They have to be mutually agreeing on things. So one person can't set the tone. If someone changes their mind, they can always stop. Like all these things about consent are layered. And in terms of relationships and love and all of that good stuff, I want to remind everyone who's listening that regardless of if or how long you've been with a partner or partners, sex is never, ever a given, and you can never assume someone's consent. So I don't care if you've slept with someone 1,700 times, you've been married for 5 decades, every time you're sexually intimate, you both have to consent.
Are there, what are the, because you mentioned a few nonverbal, like yes cues. What are some nonverbal no cues?
Some nonverbal no cues are, again, a head nod no, right? Sometimes if we're feeling like we just can't open our mouth, shaking your head no, pushing someone away or off or just a little bit further is a good signifier that someone's like, you know, physically stopping you. Getting up or like off the couch or bed or shower or car or wherever you are, removing yourself physically is obviously an indicator that something needs to stop or be discussed. If someone's showing any type of physical resistance, like they don't really want their clothes to be taken off, or they're not like physically into it, they're not pulling closer, or they're not, you know, feeling enthusiastic or excited, it's a great time to pause and be like, hey, are you okay? Or is this not feeling good? Or, you know, what's up? Just taking a pause. It might be something that you can talk through and continue. It might be because the person isn't feeling okay or into it and has to stop. So, you know, physically getting up is a great way, but you can also do the head nod or kind of push somebody away, for example.
Breaks can be taken, like things can stop and questions can be asked. I feel like that's not spoken like about remotely near enough, but like think you can take breaks. Yeah.
Oh my God, please take a break, relax, have fun. Like I just feel, and you know what I think part of it is that people take porn as sex education. And if you are someone who has not experienced sex education or, you know, in a comprehensive and a positive way, please Google reputable sites, right? Like a local hospital in your area. For folks in New York City, Mount Sinai has a wonderful sexual health education and testing program. You can learn about it on their website, Excuse These Sirens. Planned Parenthood has so many resources online about safer sex items like dental dams, condoms, contraceptive, STIs, how to talk about STIs. Like there is actual information out there. It is not in porn. In porn, they're not using protection of any kind. They're not taking breaks. They're not communicating. They're not like having any awkward movements. Like it's totally fake. And hopefully people are getting paid for their work because they're acting. So please take a break. Please ask your partner if you want something different, or if you want to switch, or, whatever. If you cannot talk about what you're doing, you might not be in the place to do it or with the right partner to do it with.
And just another thing I'd written down. What are the scenarios where consent just simply cannot be given, even if someone might be saying yes?
Good question. If somebody is saying yes, but they're at the point of incapacitation. So what I was referencing before is a point of intoxication where someone can no longer legally make decisions for themselves about their body, right? So they are legally not able to give consent. So what's tricky about incapacitation is that it can look different on different people, which is, again, why it's so important to get that verbal and nonverbal consent, and why if we're ever unsure that we're getting it, we have to stop, right? Because somebody could be laughing and dancing and having fun an hour ago, and now they're at the point where they are not okay, right? So incapacitation might look like getting sick, like throwing up, specifically from alcohol I'm referencing, or, just not having awareness of like where they are, what year is it, what happened before. In coming in and out of consciousness, like, right, someone just like can't stay awake. Of course, they're not in the place to consent or do anything sexually intimate. But I will say that some folks who black out, for example, you might not notice at face value. You might be like, hey, what's up? And they're like, hey, I'm good. How are you? And you just can't tell. Some people show their speech when they've had 2 drinks versus 10. So again, it's hard to know unless you really know your partner or your friend, and you typically know how they appear when they're okay or not. It's always safer to ask. And if you're feeling like you're not getting the information, or you yourself are at a place of severe intoxication from alcohol or anything else, it's got to be time to stop. And so what I typically recommend people do is, if you are someone who chooses to use drugs or drink, and also someone who chooses to be sexually active, get to know yourself with these substances, right? In terms of exploring your relationship with alcohol or with weed or with cocaine, whatever you're doing, it's not for me to judge, but it's for me to recommend that you get really used to what you feel like under those substances, and know your limits. Like, know when you can't make good decisions anymore, because that's a great time to remind yourself that you can't be sexually active. And so again, consent is about caring for your partner and showing that care through questions and stopping and pauses and all that good stuff. And I always tell people, like, if you really like someone, try again another time. Like this, if this feels like the only time that you're able to be intimate with someone, it's probably not a good idea anyway.
Yeah, that's very smart. Good. So I guess in the terms of, like, I guess we slightly touched on hookup culture. Could you just speak briefly on the difference between hookup culture and then also sex and love? Because those things are typically tied, but like in real life, not really, not always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I love talking about hookup culture because I think it's fascinating and like so liberatory and also so problematic. And I just like can't get enough of thinking about it. So thanks for your question. Hookup culture is essentially a culture in which casual sex, and when I say that, I refer to sex that is not rooted in a significantly emotional relationship. Casual sex is accepted, right? And it might even be promoted. It might be expected, which is when it becomes a little bit unhealthy. But hookup culture means that people can have multiple sexual partners. These are partners that we're not necessarily, going on dates with or bringing to family functions or like sleeping over every other night. These are people that are in our lives for a specific sexual purpose, right? They also might be our friends or something. But that sexual part is not necessarily connected to love or emotion. So, the healthy parts of hookup culture are that it can be super, like I said, liberatory. People are owning their bodies, saying yes when they want to, saying no when they don't want to. It could be really exploratory, especially for folks that are newer to their sexuality or away from home for the first time and want to explore different kinds of sex, right? Or they're in New York City and now they're learning about like kink and BDSM and things that they might want to try, or, partners of different genders, whatever it might be. Those are really great parts of hookup culture for a lot of young people or older people. So as long as it's consensual and intentional, that's fine. The negative parts, which kind of refers to your question, is that I think that there are a lot of expectations, and I hear this from students, and I've seen this from people in my own life, where hookup culture gets to a point where it is discouraging us for being honest about our emotions, right? Sometimes I've seen hookup culture get in someone's head enough to the point where they feel judged for asking for what they actually want or being honest about their feelings, or, two partners were kind of on the same page about being casual, and then one grows more intense feelings, and now we're in an issue. And so I would say, if you're looking for a relationship, okay, my first suggestion is believe what people tell you, right? So if you start hooking up with somebody, hooking up can mean whatever it means to you, and they say, you know what, I really don't want a relationship. Like, I don't want a partner right now. And you're like, okay, I know I do, but let's just see what happens. Is that the most informed choice we can make? And maybe it's not, maybe it is. Like, again, it's not me, but I think that people, for example, need to really trust their partners, sexual, intimate friends, whoever, believe what they're saying. If someone goes into something and says, I don't want a relationship, we have to trust and respect that person enough to not try to change their mind through sex, for example, because that's a manipulation of sex. People who are in love with a partner might use sex to become closer, might use sex to feel more bonded or connected or advance their relationship, right? We've been dating, we like each other, and we make a choice to become sexually intimate to further what we're doing. Sex is just as valid if that connection isn't there, if those intentions for partnership or group partnership aren't there. No sex is better or worse than others as long as it's enjoyable and consensual for everybody. But I think that where hookup culture kind of goes wrong is when people are working under expectations that have been placed upon them, or pressure, or like any of that icky stuff, right? So I think sex with people you love is really healthy. I think sex with people who you don't love can be really healthy too. Again, it goes back to that sexual project of like, why do I want to have sex, and why do I want to have sex with this person? And just using that understanding to kind of fuel your choices is probably a good way to go.
Okay, cool. I've only been in New York for quarantine, so I'm just like, totally. I have no clue. Yeah. I've
really
never experienced not coronavirus New York.
Oh, where are you from?
North Carolina.
Okay. And what year are you again?
I'm a freshman.
Oh, right. Because I was in your class. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? New York isn't dead, and you're going to have a lot of time to have a really good experience. And I know that to be true.
I hope so. Yeah. But thank you. It's always nice to hear.
Yes. You're welcome.
Question. Oh, okay. So now we're going back to the sort of consensual topic.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's odd to word this, but there are a lot of labels for these situations. I'm sure there's assault, there's rape, there's harassment and sexual harassment. What should someone do if they're just not positive which of these, if any of them, are, like, they've had a situation and they have one in their head, but they're not sure what it is or if it's any of these?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How could they start sort of getting into that realm, I guess?
That's a really good question. I'll do my best to answer. If you feel like I'm not fully answering it, let me know and I'll shift. So if somebody feels like they have experienced any form of sexual assault, harassment, exploitation, they feel that they might be stalked, or they're in an unhealthy or abusive relationship, I think that a resource that is, really there to help you is going to be less concerned with the definitions and with the, specificities of each definition, and more concerned about what you need, right? So for example, at PACE, if students come to see me, a lot of the time students are confused about what happened. And so I'll say also that I would never want somebody to hesitate or wait to get support or to talk about an issue just because they're not sure if like their experience was bad enough, or their experience was like a big enough deal. And I'm doing air quotes for folks that are listening on audio. Those things do not exist, right? And if you are working with me specifically at PACE, there is no such thing as like not a big enough deal to get support. Because if somebody feels like they cannot safely go to work or home or class or on the train because they don't feel comfortable because they've been harassed, or somebody feels like, they were in a sexual situation that was out of their control, or that they were disrespected in that situation, there's no such thing as not a big enough deal, right? So that's what I really want to say first. And again, I've said it before in our time together, but I really want people to get in the habit of trusting themselves. You are the only person that knows how you're feeling and what happened, right? And so I want students to feel safe. I want all people to feel safe and healthy and confident and good, right? And so if somebody's experienced something, whether it's being catcalled on the street or, an experience of physically forced, sex, for example, or sexual assault, nothing is more important than something else. So I think that students or anybody who needs some support around these things should absolutely not hesitate to get it, right? Because again, it's not a resource's job to judge what happened to you or to pick it apart to figure out what it is, unless maybe you're working with the police, but other supportive resources or advocates typically won't do that. So I think like for students at PACE, for example, you can always contact me. Or counseling or public safety. I think for folks that are listening that aren't at PACE, most colleges and universities will have somebody like me. Not everybody is confidential. So I would look on your colleges or, company's website and look for people who are either like in the Title IX office or in compliance might be a word that comes up, or anything to do with sexual wellness or sexual assault, or, these are kind of buzzwords that might be on a website, for example, and just get into contact with somebody because, 9 times out of 10, even if you get into contact with someone who's not exactly the right person, they'll refer you to somebody else. And if you are at, if you're not in college, if you want some resources, every city has a resource center, right? Or has a domestic violence, hotline, or has a shelter, or has somebody that you can kind of reach out to. There are a couple of national hotlines that are really, really helpful, like the domestic violence hotline, the sexual assault hotline through RAINN, that's RAINN. These are all places that you can kind of start. But again, if you're at a university or a college or a K through 12, it's great because you have those built-in supports a little bit. So why not use them? They're free and they're there for you. There are legal differences between the terms sexual assault versus rape, or dating versus domestic violence. And typically it's intricacies around adjudicating those experiences if there is an investigation or something. But I'd say for most folks, it is a genuine concern of like, what happened to me, which is so valid. That's something that you can talk through with a resource, right?
Do you think then that there's too much weight put on these words in these discussions? Like, it's a lot. Do you think it's more focused on labels than aid? Where do you fall on that?
That is such a good question. And I really love that question. I think it depends. Language is such an interesting thing, and like terminology is such an interesting thing because it does something different for everybody. I know a lot of, survivors of sexual assault, for example, that come right out with saying, I've experienced sexual assault, or they like to use the R word of rape, which I typically don't lead with because I find it to be particularly triggering for folks sometimes. But there are people who want to own that word. It's a reclamation of an experience. And you see that in a lot of communities that have been historically marginalized against or oppressed, right? Where they're reclaiming words that have been used against them. And that is similar in some ways to folks who've experienced some type of interpersonal harm. So I think the terminology can benefit people, and people can find like power and ownership in those words. And if that's the case, then fully go ahead. I would more than support that, right? For some people who don't feel comfortable using sexual assault, for example, to explain their experience, or they don't want to say that their relationship with their partner was abusive, like that label just negatively impacts them, then they don't have to use it. And I don't care either way. So I think to answer your question, it really depends on the person. Like, am I seeing with what the person says that they are placing a lot of weight on this term and it's helping them kind of push through the day? Like, I'm a survivor. Like, that term helps people sometimes. Some people don't associate with it. So when I'm working individually with students, for example, I will encourage them to use whatever terminology or not that makes them feel the best about what happened or how they're going to move forward. I think I'm not a huge fan of how the criminal justice system handles a lot of issues, including interpersonal harm, right? Sexual assault or domestic violence, something like that. I feel like the emphasis on definitions and intricacies that are really difficult for folks to go through and describe, like what is the benefit there. I also understand that sometimes aid and support and service can only be granted if certain things are met. So I see the benefit to the terminology. I think that really it depends on what the survivor, the person who's experienced these things, wants. And if terminology helps them, then I'm really in favor of it.
Okay. Well, now we're going to go into more, I guess, just overarching, I don't want to say lighter topics, but like, more just straight advice. This episode, this interview is going to be scheduled to go out on Valentine's Day. Yeah. Is there anything you think that people should remember or keep in mind today? Single, in a relationship, anything, the day of love, all of that.
Oh, you know what? I do have some advice, and I think it's contradictory because all good advice should be a little nuanced. I think that if you're lonely on Valentine's Day, it's totally fine. Like, I am not in favor of toxic positivity. I'm not in the business of telling people to be really happy they're single if they want a partner, for example. You want, you want a partner and you should get one. And I hope that you do, right? I think that people who feel really empty or lonely or sad on something like Valentine's Day have a lot of reason why. I've been single on Valentine's Days. I've been not single on Valentine's Days. And I think that it really is what you make of it. I think that platonic love, like love with your friends, is so undervalued. And I'm all in favor of really amping up the way that we love our friends. And you can be, that can look like anything you want, but just really cherishing those relationships, I think, is something to not neglect, or like love for your family, or et cetera. I think, for example, like a holiday like Thanksgiving, with really, 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 really horrible history and roots that a lot of people don't even celebrate, I choose to make it something really different. I use gratefulness as sort of a word to lead me through the day. That looks like a million different things to me. None have anything to do with the atrocious history of Thanksgiving. But I will take it to, generosity and gratefulness can mean donating to communities that have been harmed through the history of Thanksgiving. It can mean really, emailing my family and being like, this is what you all mean to me. So that's an example to say Valentine's Day can literally be whatever you want. If you take it as a regular Tuesday or whatever it's going to be, power to you. If you want to be really sad that day because you're grieving a relationship or the lack thereof, do it. If you want to just have the best night ever with your partners, do it. I think it's really about what you make of it. But again, I would never fault someone for feeling really sad on Valentine's Day. Just ride that out,
Yeah. And then sort of dovetailing into it, and the final question that I have, what tends to be one of the largest things about all of the topics that we've covered, or just sex and love and hookups in general, that you wish more people were educated on?
Oh, I have so many answers to this. I think it really all boils down. I mean, I'm thinking of a million different things, like, things and behaviors and relationships and assumptions and gender stuff and horrible sex ed in this country and all of these things. But to me, it really boils down to, like, do what makes you feel good. Do what makes you happy. And I think it can be as simple as that. Again, I will say every time with the caveat that it cannot be hurting yourself or someone else. It has to be consensual. It has to, in theory, it has to be legal. But outside of that, what makes you feel good? Sexually, in relationships with yourself, you should be happy with your partners. Sex should feel good. It should not hurt. Ever. That's something that I would really want people to know. Sex is not supposed to be painful. And I mean that, like, in every sense, including how it feels physically. People think that, like, you're, the first time you're intimate, or specifically with penetration, the first couple times it's supposed to hurt. It's actually not. You probably need more lube if it's painful, or a different position, or go to a doctor, right? There are reasons why. But I think it shouldn't hurt. It should feel good. It should feel, there are people there that want to help you, right? And you're not the first person to be in an unhealthy relationship or in a dynamic that's not healthy or whatever it might be. But if we start talking to each other about this, we could find the last, right, in our lifetime. And that's really what I'm working towards. So my mottos, like I said, lead with kindness, do what makes you feel good, and mind your business are my sex and relationship advice.
Thank you for listening to this interview and our podcast as a whole. We're so grateful for each listener who's come our way, and we hope you've taken something special from each story we've told. To close this out, here are a few resources from Juliette to help you with your own love stories. Thank you for listening to DefLove, Defining Love. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is 1-800-656-4673. They are run by RAINN, RAINN, and you can find them at www.rainn.org. College students are encouraged to find their own school's resources by searching on their school's website for a similar office to Juliette's. Another National Sexual Assault Hotline is 1-800-799-7223. And if you prefer a crisis text line, you can text 741-741.